Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 4. Tales of Power. Part 1. A Witness to the Acts of Power. The Dreamer and the Dreamed. I drove to Don Juan's house and arrived there in the early morning. I had spent the night in a motel on the way down so I would get to his house before noon. Don Juan was in the back and came to the front when I called him. He gave me a warm greeting and the impression that he was pleased to see me. He made a comment that I thought was intended to put me at ease, but produced the opposite effect. "I heard you coming," he said as he grinned. "And I ran to the back. I was afraid that if I had stayed here you would have been frightened." He casually remarked that I was somber and heavy. He said that I reminded him of Eligio, who was morbid enough to be a good sorcerer, but too morbid to become a man of knowledge. He added that the only way to counteract the devastating effect of the sorcerer's world was to laugh at it. He was right in his assessment of my mood. I was indeed worried and frightened. We went for a long walk. It took hours for my feelings to ease up. Walking with him made me feel better than if he had attempted to talk me out of my somberness. We returned to his house in the late afternoon. I was famished. After eating we sat under his ramada. The sky was clear. The afternoon light made me feel complacent. I wanted to talk. "I've felt uneasy for months," I said. "There was something truly awesome in what you and Don Juan said and did the last time I was here." Don Juan did not say anything. He got up and moved around the ramada. "I've got to talk about this," I said. "It obsesses me and I can't stop pondering upon it." "Are you afraid?" he asked. I was not afraid but baffled, overwhelmed by what I had heard and witnessed. The loopholes in my reason were so gigantic that either I had to repair them or I had to dispose of my reason altogether. My comments made him laugh. "Don't throw away your reason yet," he said. "It's not time for it. It'll happen though, but I don't think that now is the moment." "Should I try to find an explanation for what happened, then?" I asked. "Certainly," he retorted. "It's your duty to put your mind at ease. Warriors do not win victories by beating their heads against walls, but by overtaking the walls. Warriors jump over the walls, they don't demolish them." "How can I jump over this one?" I asked. "First of all, I think it's deadly wrong for you to regard anything in such a serious fashion," he said as he sat down by my side. "There are 3 kinds of bad habits which we use over and over when confronted with unusual life situations. First, we may disregard what's happening or has happened and feel as if it had never occurred. That one is the bigot's way. Second, we may accept everything at its face value and feel as if we know what's going on. That's the pious man's way. Third, we may become obsessed with an event because either we cannot disregard it or we cannot accept it wholeheartedly. That's the fool's way. Your way? There is a fourth, the correct one, the warrior's way. A warrior acts as if nothing had ever happened because he doesn't believe in anything, yet he accepts everything at its face value. He accepts without accepting and disregards without disregarding. He never feels as if he knows, neither does he feel as if nothing had ever happened. He acts as if he is in control, even though he might be shaking in his boots. To act in such a manner dissipates obsession." We were quiet for a long time. Don Juan's words were like a bomb to me. Can I talk about Don Gennaro and his double? I asked. It depends on what you want to say about him, he replied. Are you going to indulge in being obsessed? I want to indulge in explanations, I said. I'm obsessed because I haven't dared come to see you, and I haven't been able to talk about my qualms and doubts with anyone. Don't you talk with your friends? I do, but how could they help me? I never thought that you needed help. You must cultivate the feeling that a warrior needs nothing. You say you need help. Help for what? You have everything needed for the extravagant journey that is your life. I have tried to teach you that the real experience is to be a man, and that what counts is being alive. Life is the little detour that we are taking now. Life in itself is sufficient, self-explanatory and complete. A warrior understands this and lives accordingly. Therefore, one may say without being presumptuous that the experience of experiences is being a warrior. He seemed to wait for me to say something. I hesitated for a moment. I wanted to select my words carefully. If a warrior needs solace, he went on, he simply chooses anyone and expresses to that person every detail of his turmoil. After all, the warrior is not seeking to be understood or helped. By talking, he's merely relieving himself of his pressure. That is, providing that the warrior is given to talking. If he's not, he tells no one. But you're not living like a warrior altogether. Not yet anyway. And the pitfalls that you encounter must be truly monumental. You have all my sympathy. He was not being facetious. Judging by the concern in his eyes, he seemed to be one who had been there himself. He stood up and patted me on the head. He walked back and forth the length of the Ramada and looked casually to the chaparral around the house. His movements evoked a sensation of restlessness in me. In order to relax, I began to talk about my dilemma. I felt that it was inherently too late for me to pretend to be an innocent bystander. Under his guidance, I had trained myself to achieve strange perceptions, such as stopping the internal dialogue and controlling my dreams. Those were instances that could not be faked. I had followed his suggestions, although never to the letter, and had partially succeeded in disrupting daily routines, assuming responsibility for my acts, erasing personal history, and had finally arrived at a point which years before I had dreaded. I was capable of being alone without disrupting my physical or emotional well-being. That was perhaps my single most astounding triumph. From the point of view of my former expectations and moods, to be alone and not go out of my mind was an inconceivable state. I was keenly aware of all the changes that had taken place in my life and in my view of the world, and I was also aware that it was somehow superfluous to be affected so profoundly by Don Juan and Don Gennaro's revelation about the double. "What's wrong with me, Don Juan?" I asked. "You indulge," he snapped. "You feel that indulging in doubts and tribulations is the sign of a sensitive man. Well, the truth of the matter is that you're the farthest thing from being sensitive. So why pretend? I told you the other day, a warrior accepts in humbleness what he is. You make it sound as if I were confusing myself deliberately," I said. "We do confuse ourselves deliberately," he said. "All of us are aware of our doings. Our puny reason deliberately makes itself into the monster it fancies itself to be. It's too little for such a big mold, though." I explained to him that my dilemma was perhaps more complex than what he was making it out to be. I said that as long as he and Don Gennaro were men like myself, their superior control made them models for my own behavior. But if they were in essence men drastically different than I, then I could not conceive of them any longer as models, but as oddities, which I could not possibly aspire to emulate. Gennaro is a man, Don Juan said in a reassuring tone. He's no longer a man like yourself, true. But that's his accomplishment, and it shouldn't give rise to fear on your part. If he's different, the more reason to admire him. But his difference is not a human difference, I said. And what do you think it is? The difference between a man and a horse? I don't know. But he's not like me. He was at one time, though. But can his change be understood by me? Of course. You yourself are changing. Do you mean that I will develop a double? No one develops a double. That's only a way of talking about it. You, for all the talking you do, are a sap for words. You get trapped by their meanings. Now you think that one develops a double through evil means, I suppose. All of us luminous beings have a double. All of us. A warrior learns to be aware of it, that's all. There are seemingly insurmountable barriers protecting that awareness. But that's expected. Those barriers are what makes arriving at that awareness such a unique challenge. Why am I so afraid of it, Don Juan? Because you're thinking that the double is what the word says, a double, or another you. I chose those words in order to describe it. The double is oneself and cannot be faced in any other way. What if I don't want to have it? The double is not a matter of personal choice. Neither is it a matter of personal choice who is selected to learn the sorcerer's knowledge that leads to that awareness. Have you ever asked yourself, why you in particular? All the time. I've asked you that question hundreds of times, but you've never answered it. I didn't mean that you should ask it as a question that begs an answer, but in the sense of a warrior's pondering on his great fortune, the fortune of having found a challenge. To make it into an ordinary question is the device of a conceited ordinary man who wants to be either admired or pitied for it. I have no interest in that kind of question, because there is no way of answering it. The decision of picking you was a design of power. No one can discern the designs of power. Now that you've been selected, there is nothing that you can do to stop the fulfillment of that design. But you yourself told me, Don Juan, that one can always fail. That's true. One can always fail. But I think that you are referring to something else. You want to find a way out. You want to have the freedom to fail and quit on your own terms. Too late for that. A warrior is in the hands of power, and his only freedom is to choose an impeccable life. There is no way to fake triumph or defeat. Your reason may want you to fail altogether in order to obliterate the totality of yourself. But there is a countermeasure which will not permit you to declare a false victory or defeat. If you think that you can retreat to the haven of failure, you're out of your mind. Your body will stand guard and will not let you go either way. He began to chuckle softly. Why do you laugh? I asked. You're in a terrible spot, he said. It's too late for you to retreat, but too soon to act. All you can do is witness. You're in the miserable position of an infant who cannot return to the mother's womb, but neither can he run around and act. All an infant can do is witness and listen to the stupendous tales of action being told to him. You are at that precise point now. You cannot go back to the womb of your old world, but you cannot act with power either. For you there is only witnessing acts of power and listening to tales Tales of power. The double is one of those tales. You know that, and that's why your reason is so taken by it. You are beating your head against a wall if you pretend to understand. All that I can say about it, by way of explanation, is that the double, although it is arrived at through dreaming, is as real as it can be. According to what you've told me, Don Juan, the double can perform acts. Can the double then? He did not let me continue with my line of reasoning. He reminded me that it was inappropriate to say that he had told me about the double, when I could say that I had witnessed it. Obviously the double can perform acts, I said. Obviously, he replied. But can the double act in behalf of the self? It is the self, damn it. I found it very difficult to explain myself. I had in mind that if a sorcerer could perform two actions at once, his capacity for utilitarian production had to double. He could work two jobs, be in two places, see two persons, and so on, at once. Don Juan listened patiently. Let me put it this way, I said. Hypothetically, can Don Gennaro kill someone hundreds of miles away by letting his double do it? Don Juan looked at me. He shook his head and moved his eyes away. You're filled with tales of violence, he said. Gennaro cannot kill anyone, simply because he no longer has any interest in his fellow men. By the time a warrior is capable of conquering seeing and dreaming and having the awareness of his luminosity, there is no such interest left in him. I pointed out that at the beginning of my apprenticeship, he had made the statement that a sorcerer, aided by his ally, could be transported over hundreds of miles to deliver a blow to his enemies. I am responsible for your confusion, he said. But you must remember that on another occasion I told you that, with you, I was not following the steps my own teacher prescribed. He was a sorcerer and I should have properly plunged you into that world. I didn't, because I am no longer concerned with the ups and downs of my fellow men. Yet, my teacher's words stuck with me. I talked to you many times in the manner he himself would have talked. Gennaro is a man of knowledge, the purest of them all. His actions are impeccable. He's beyond ordinary men, and beyond sorcerers. His double is an expression of his joy and his humor. Thus, he cannot possibly use it to create or resolve ordinary situations. As far as I know, the double is the awareness of our state as luminous beings. It can do anything, and yet it chooses to be unobtrusive and gentle. It was my error to mislead you with borrowed words. My teacher was not capable of producing the effects Gennaro does. For my teacher, unfortunately, certain things were, as they are for you, only tales of power. I was compelled to defend my point. I said that I was speaking in a hypothetical sense. There is no hypothetical sense when you speak about the world of men of knowledge, he said. A man of knowledge cannot possibly act towards his fellow men in injurious terms, hypothetically or otherwise. But what if his fellow men are plotting against his security and well-being? Can he then use his double to protect himself? He clicked his tongue in disapproval. What incredible violence in your thoughts, he said. No one can plot against the security and well-being of a man of knowledge. He sees, therefore he would take steps to avoid anything like that. Gennaro, for example, has taken a calculated risk in joining you. But there is nothing that you could do to endanger his security. If there is anything, his seeing will let him know. Now, if there is something about you that is inherently injurious to him and his seeing cannot reach it, then it is his fate, And neither Gennaro nor anyone else can avoid that. So, you see, a man of knowledge is in control without controlling anything. We were quiet. The sun was about to reach the top of the heavy tall bushes on the west side of the house. There were about 2 hours of daylight left. "Why don't you call Gennaro?" Don Juan said casually. My body jumped. My initial reaction was to drop everything and run for my car. Don Juan broke into a belly laugh. I told him that I did not have to prove anything to myself, and that I was perfectly content to talk to him. Don Juan could not stop laughing. Finally he said that it was a shame that Don Gennaro was not there to enjoy a great scene. "Look, if you're not interested in calling Gennaro, I am," he said in a resolute tone. "I like his company." I had a terrible sour taste on the roof of my mouth. Beads of perspiration ran down from my brow and my upper lip. I wanted to say something, but there was really nothing to say. Don Juan gave me a long, scrutinizing look. "Come on," he said. "A warrior is always ready. To be a warrior is not a simple matter of wishing to be one. It is rather an endless struggle that will go on to the very last moment of our lives. Nobody is born a warrior, in exactly the same way that nobody is born a reasonable being. We make ourselves into one or the other. Pull yourself together. I don't want Gennaro to see you shivering like this." He stood up and paced back and forth on the clean floor of the ramada. I could not remain impassive. My nervousness was so intense that I could not write anymore, and I jumped to my feet. Don Juan made me jog on the spot, facing the west. He had made me perform the same movements before on various occasions. The idea was to draw power from the impending twilight by raising one's arms to the sky, with the fingers stretched, like a fan, and then clasp them forcefully when the arms were in the midpoint between the horizon and the zenith. The exercise worked and I became almost instantly calm and collected. I could not avoid wondering, however, what had happened to the old me that could never have relaxed so completely by performing those simple and idiotic movements. I wanted to focus all my attention on the procedure that Don Juan was doubtlessly going to follow to call Don Gennaro. I anticipated some portentous acts. Don Juan stood on the edge of the ramada facing the southeast, cupped his hands around his mouth, and yelled, "Gennaro, come here." A moment later Don Gennaro emerged from the chaparral. Both of them were beaming. They practically danced in front of me. Don Gennaro greeted me effusively and then sat down on the milk crate. There was something dreadfully wrong with me. I was calm, unruffled. Some incredible state of indifference and aloofness had taken over my entire being. It was almost as if I were watching myself from a hiding place. In a very nonchalant manner I proceeded to tell Don Gennaro that during my last visit, he had nearly scared me to death, and that not even during my experiences with psychotropic plants had I been in such a complete state of chaos. Both of them celebrated my statements as if they were meant to be funny. I laughed with them. They obviously were aware of my state of emotional numbness. They watched me and humored me as if I were drunk. There was something inside me that fought desperately to turn the situation into something familiar. I wanted to be concerned and afraid. Don Juan finally splashed some water on my face and urged me to sit down and take notes. He said, as he had done before, that either I took notes or I died. The mere act of putting down some words brought back my familiar mood. It was as if something became crystal clear again, something that a moment before had been opaque and numb. The advent of my usual self also meant the advent of my usual fears. Strangely enough, I was less afraid of being afraid than of being unafraid. The familiarity of my old habits, no matter how unpleasant they were, was a delightful respite. I fully realized then that Don Gennaro had just emerged from the chaparral. My usual processes were beginning to function. I started by refusing to think or speculate about the event. I made the resolution of not asking him anything. I was going to be a silent witness this time. "Gennaro has come again, exclusively for you," Don Juan said. Don Gennaro was leaning against a wall of the house, resting his back against it while he sat on a tilted milk crate. He looked as if he were riding on horseback. His hands were in front of him, giving the impression that he was holding the reins of a horse. "That's right, Carlitos," he said, and brought the milk crate to rest on the ground. He dismounted, whirling his right leg over an imaginary neck of a horse, and then jumped to the ground. His movements were so perfectly executed that he gave me the unquestionable sensation that he had arrived on horseback. He came to my side and sat down to my left. "Gennaro has come because he wants to tell you about the other," Don Juan said. He made a gesture of giving Don Gennaro the floor. Don Gennaro bowed. He turned slightly to face me. "What would you like to know, Carlitos?" he asked in a high-pitched voice. "Well, if you're going to tell me about the double, tell me everything," I said, feigning casualness. Both of them shook their heads and glanced at each other. "Gennaro is going to tell you about the dreamer and the dreamed," Don Juan said. "As you know, Carlitos," Don Gennaro said with the air of an orator warming up, "the double begins in dreaming." He gave me a long look and smiled. His eyes swept from my face to my notebook and pencil. "The double is a dream," he said, scratched his arms and then stood up. He walked to the edge of the ramada and stepped out into the chaparral. He stood by a bush showing 3/4 of his profile to us. He was apparently urinating. After a moment I noticed that there seemed to be something wrong with him. He appeared to be trying desperately to urinate, but could not. Don Juan's laughter was the clue that Don Gennaro was clowning again. Don Gennaro contorted his body in such a comical fashion that he had Don Juan and me practically in hysterics. Don Gennaro came back to the ramada and sat down. His smile radiated a rare warmth. "When you can't, you just can't," he said and shrugged his shoulders. Then after a moment's pause he added, sighing, "Yes, Carlitos, the double is a dream." "Do you mean that he's not real?" I asked. "No. I mean that he is a dream," he retorted. Don Juan intervened and explained that Don Gennaro was referring to the first emergence of the awareness that we are luminous beings. Each one of us is different, and thus the details of our struggles are different, Don Juan said. The steps that we follow to arrive at the double are the same, though. Especially the beginning steps, which are muddled and uncertain. Don Gennaro agreed and made a comment on the uncertainty that the sorcerer had at that stage. "When it first happened to me, I didn't know it had happened," he explained. "One day I had been picking plants in the mountains. I had gone into a place that was worked by other herb collectors. I had 2 huge sacks of plants. I was ready to go home, but before I did I decided to take a moment's rest. I lay down on the side of the trail in the shade of a tree, and I fell asleep. I heard then the sound of people coming down the hill and woke up. I hurriedly ran for cover and hid behind some bushes a short distance across the road from where I had fallen asleep. While I hid there, I had the nagging impression I had forgotten something. I looked to see if I had my 2 sacks of plants. I didn't have them. I looked across the road to the place where I had been sleeping, and I nearly dropped my pants with fright. I was still there asleep. It was me. I touched my body. I was myself. By that time the people that were coming down the hill were upon the me that was asleep, while the me that was fully awake looked helplessly from my hiding place. Damn it to hell. They were going to find me there and take my sacks away. But they went by me as if I were not there at all. My vision had been so vivid that I went wild. I screamed and then I woke up again. Damn it. It had been a dream. Don Juan stopped his account and looked at me as if waiting for a question or a comment. Tell him where you woke up the second time, Don Juan said. I woke up by the road, Don Juan said, where I had fallen asleep. But for one moment I didn't quite know where I really was. I can almost say that I was still looking at myself waking up, then something pulled me to the side of the road, and I found myself rubbing my eyes. There was a long pause. I did not know what to say. And what did you do next? Don Juan asked. I realized, when both of them began to laugh, that he was teasing me. He was imitating my questions. Don Juan went on talking. He said that he was stunned for a moment and then went to check everything. The place where I had hid was there exactly as I had seen it, he said. And the people who had walked by me were down the road, a short distance away. I know it because I ran downhill after them. They were the same people I had seen. I followed them until they got to town. They must have thought I was mad. I asked them if they had seen my friend sleeping by the side of the road. They all said they hadn't. You see, Don Juan said, all of us go through the same doubts. We are afraid of being mad. Unfortunately for us, of course, all of us are already mad. You are a tinge madder than us, though, Don Juan said to me and winked. And more suspicious. They teased me about my suspiciousness. And then Don Juan began to talk again. All of us are dense beings, he said. You're not the only one, Carlitos. I was a bit shook up by my dream for a couple of days, but then I had to work for my living and take care of too many things, and really had no time for pondering upon the mystery of my dreams. So I forgot about it in no time at all. I was very much like you. But one day, a few months later, after a terribly tiring day, I fell asleep like a log in mid-afternoon. It had just started to rain and a leak in the roof woke me up. I jumped out of bed and climbed on top of the house to fix the leak before it began to pour. I felt so fine and strong that I finished in 1 minute, and I didn't even get wet. I thought that the snooze I had taken had done me a lot of good. When I was through, I went back into the house to get something to eat, and I realized that I could not swallow. I thought I was sick. I mashed some roots and leaves and wrapped them around my neck and went to my bed. And then again when I got to my bed I nearly dropped my pants. I was there in bed asleep. I wanted to shake myself and wake me up, but I knew that that was not the thing one should do. So I ran out of the house. I was panic-stricken. I roamed around the hills aimlessly. I had no idea where I was going, and although I had lived all my life there, I got lost. I walked in the rain and didn't even feel it. It seemed that I couldn't think. Then the lightning and thunder became so intense that I woke up again." He paused for a moment. "Do you want to know where I woke up?" he asked me. "Certainly," Don Juan answered. "I woke up in the hills in the rain," he said. "But how did you know that you had woken up?" I asked. "My body knew it," he replied. "That was a stupid question," Don Juan interjected. "You yourself know that something in the warrior is always aware of every change. It is precisely the aim of the warrior's way to foster and maintain that awareness. The warrior cleans it, shines it, and keeps it running." He was right. I had to admit to them that I knew that there was something in me that registered and was aware of everything I did. And yet it had nothing to do with the ordinary awareness of myself. It was something else which I could not pin down. I told them that perhaps Don Gennaro could describe it better than I. "You're doing very well yourself," Don Gennaro said. "It's an inner voice that tells you what's what." And at that time, it told me that I had woken up a second time. Of course, as soon as I woke up I became convinced that I must have been dreaming. Obviously it had not been an ordinary dream, but it hadn't been dreaming proper either. So I settled for something else. Walking in my sleep, half awake, I suppose. I could not understand it in any other way. Don Gennaro said that his benefactor had explained to him that what he had gone through was not a dream at all, and that he should not insist on regarding it as walking in his sleep. "What did he tell you that it was?" I asked. They exchanged a glance. "He told me it was the bogeyman," Don Gennaro replied, affecting the tone of a small child. I explained to them that I wanted to know if Don Gennaro's benefactor explained things in the same way they themselves did. "Of course he did," Don Juan said. "My benefactor explained that the dream in which one was watching oneself asleep," Don Gennaro went on, "was the time of the double. He recommended that rather than wasting my power in wondering and asking myself questions, I should use the opportunity to act, and that when I had another chance I should be prepared. My next chance took place at my benefactor's house. I was helping him with the housework. I had lain down to rest and as usual I fell sound asleep. His house was definitely a place of power for me and helped me. I was suddenly aroused by a loud noise and awakened. My benefactor's house was large. He was a wealthy man and had many people working for him. The noise seemed to be the sound of a shovel digging in gravel. I sat up to listen and then I stood up. The noise was very unsettling to me, but I couldn't figure out why. I was pondering whether to go and check it out when I noticed that I was asleep on the floor. This time I knew what to expect and what to do and I followed the noise. I walked to the back of the house. There was no one there. The noise seemed to come from beyond the house. I kept on following it. The more I followed it, the quicker I could move. I ended up at a distant place, witnessing incredible things. He explained that at the time of those events he still was in the beginning stages of his apprenticeship and had done very little in the realm of dreaming, but that he had an uncanny facility to dream that he was looking at himself. "Where did you go, Don Gennaro?" I asked. "That was the first time that I had really moved in dreaming," he said. "I knew enough about it to behave correctly, though. I didn't look at anything directly and ended up in a deep ravine where my benefactor had some of his power plants. Do you think it works better if one knows very little about dreaming? I asked. No. Don Juan interjected. Each of us has a facility for something in particular. Genero's knack is for dreaming. What did you see in the ravine, Don Genero? I asked. I saw my benefactor doing some dangerous maneuvers with people. I thought I was there to help him and hid behind some trees. Yet I couldn't have known how to help. I was not dumb, though, and I realized that the scene was there for me to watch, not to act in. When and how and where did you wake up? I don't know when I woke up. It must have been hours later. All I know is that I followed my benefactor and the other men, and when they were about to reach my benefactor's house, the noise that they made, because they were arguing, woke me up. I was at the place where I had seen myself asleep. Upon waking up, I realized that whatever I had seen and done was not a dream. I had actually gone some distance away, guided by the sound. Was your benefactor aware of what you were doing? Certainly. He had been making the noise with the shovel to help me accomplish my task. When he walked into the house, he pretended to scold me for falling asleep. I knew that he had seen me. Later on, after his friends had left, he told me that he had noticed my glow hiding behind the trees. Don Genero said that those 3 instances set him off on the path of dreaming, and that it took him 15 years to have his next chance. The 4th time was a more bizarre and a more complete vision, he said. I found myself asleep in the middle of a cultivated field. I saw myself lying there on my side sound asleep. I knew that it was dreaming, because I had set myself to do dreaming every night. Usually, every time I had seen myself asleep, I was at the site where I had gone to sleep. This time I was not in my bed, and I knew I had gone to bed that night. In this dreaming it was daytime. So, I began to explore. I moved away from the place where I was lying and oriented myself. I knew where I was. I was actually not too far from my house, perhaps a couple of miles away. I walked around looking at every detail of the place. I stood in the shade of a big tree a short distance away and peered across a flat strip of land to some cornfields on the side of a hill. Something quite unusual struck me then. The details of the surroundings did not change or vanish, no matter how long I peered at them. I got scared and ran back to where I was sleeping. I was still there exactly as I had been before. I began to watch myself. I had an eerie feeling of indifference towards the body I was watching. Then I heard the sound of people approaching. People always seemed to be around for me. I ran up ahead to a small hill and carefully watched from there. There were 10 people coming to the field where I was. They were all young men. I ran back to where I was lying and went through one of the most agonizing times of my life, while I faced myself, lying there snoring like a pig. I knew that I had to awaken me, but I had no idea how. I also knew that it was deadly for me to awaken myself. But if those young men were to find me there, they were going to be very upset. All those deliberations that were going through my mind were not really thoughts. They were more appropriately scenes in front of my eyes. My worrying, for instance, was a scene in which I looked at myself while I had the sensation of being boxed in. I call that worrying. It has happened to me a number of times after that first time. Well, since I didn't know what to do, I stood looking at myself, waiting for the worst. A bunch of fleeting images went past me in front of my eyes. I hung on to one in particular, the side of my house and my bed. The image became very clear. Oh, how I wished to be back in my bed. Something shook me then. It felt like someone was hitting me and I woke up. I was on my bed. Obviously, I had been dreaming. I jumped out of bed and ran to the place of my dreaming. It was exactly as I had seen it. The young men were working there. I watched them for a long time. They were the same ones I had seen. I came back to the same place at the end of the day, after everybody had gone, and stood at the very spot where I had seen myself asleep. Someone had lain there. The weeds were crumpled. Don Juan and Don Genero were observing me. They looked like two strange animals. I felt a shiver in my back. I was on the verge of indulging in the very rational fear that they were not really men like myself, but Don Genero laughed. In those days, he said, I was just like you, Carlitos. I wanted to check everything. I was as suspicious as you are. He paused, raised his finger and shook it at me. Then he faced Don Juan. Weren't you as suspicious as this guy? He asked. Not a chance, Don Juan said. He's the champ. Don Genero turned to me and made a gesture of apology. I think I was wrong, he said. I was not as suspicious as you. They chuckled softly as if they did not want to make noise. Don Juan's body convulsed with muffled laughter. This is a place of power for you, Don Genero said in a whisper. You've written your fingers off right where you are sitting. Have you ever done some heavy dreaming here? No, he hasn't, Don Juan said in a low voice. But he's done some heavy writing. They doubled up. It seemed that they did not want to laugh out loud. Their bodies shook. Their soft laughter was like a rhythmical cackle. Don Genero sat up straight and slid closer to me. He patted me on the shoulder repeatedly, saying that I was a rascal. Then he pulled my left arm with great force towards him. I lost my balance and fell forward. I almost hit my face on the hard ground. I automatically put my right arm in front and buffered my fall. One of them held me down by pressing on my neck. I was not sure who. The hand that was holding me felt like Don Genero's. I had a moment of devastating panic. I felt I was fainting. Perhaps I did. The pressure in my stomach was so intense that I vomited. My next clear perception was that somebody was helping me to sit up. Don Genero was squatting in front of me. I turned around to look for Don Juan. He was nowhere in sight. Don Genero had a beaming smile. His eyes were shiny. They were looking fixedly at mine. I asked him what he had done to me, and he said that I was in pieces. His tone was reproachful, and he seemed to be annoyed or dissatisfied with me. He repeated various times that I was in pieces, and that I had to come together again. He tried to feign a severe tone, but he laughed in the middle of his harangue. He was telling me that it was just terrible that I was spread all over the place, and that he would have to use a broom to sweep all my pieces into one heap. Then he added that I might get the pieces in the wrong places and end up with my penis where my thumb should be. He cracked up at that point. I wanted to laugh and had a most unusual sensation. My body fell apart. It was as if I had been a mechanical toy that simply broke up into pieces. I had no physical feelings whatever, and neither had I any fear or concern. Coming apart was a scene that I witnessed from the point of view of the perceiver, and yet I did not perceive anything from a sensorial point of reference. The next thing I became aware of was that Don Juan was manipulating my body. I then had a physical sensation, a vibration so intense that it made me lose sight of everything around me. I felt once more that someone was helping me to sit up. I again saw Don Juan squatting in front of me. He pulled me up by my armpits and helped me walk around. I could not figure out where I was. I had the feeling I was in a dream, and yet I had a complete sense of sequential time. I was keenly aware that I had just been with Don Juan and Don Juan in the ramada of Don Juan's house. Don Juan walked with me, propping me by holding my left armpit. The scenery I was watching changed constantly. I could not determine, however, the nature of what I was observing. What was in front of my eyes was rather like a feeling or a mood, and the center from where all those changes radiated was definitely in my stomach. I had made that connection not as a thought or a realization, but as a bodily sensation that suddenly became fixed and predominant. The fluctuations around me came from my stomach. I was creating a world, an endless run of feelings and images. Everything I knew was there. That in itself was a feeling, not a thought or a conscious assessment. I tried to keep tabs for a moment because of my nearly invincible habit of assessing everything, but at a certain instant my processes of bookkeeping ceased and a nameless something enveloped me, feelings and images of every sort. At one point something in me began again the tabulation and I noticed that one image kept on repeating itself. Don Juan and Don Juan, who were trying to reach me. The image was fleeting, it passed by me fast. It was something comparable to seeing them from the window of a fast-moving vehicle. They seemed to be trying to catch me as I went by. The image became clearer and it lasted longer as it kept on recurring. I consciously realized at one point that I was deliberately isolating it from among a myriad of other images. I sort of breezed through the rest to come to that particular scene. Finally, I was capable of sustaining it by thinking about it. Once I had begun to think, my ordinary processes took over. They were not as defined as in my ordinary activities, but clear enough to know that the scene or feeling I had isolated was that Don Juan and Don Juan were in the ramada of Don Juan's house and were holding me by the armpits. I wanted to keep on fleeing through other images and feelings, but they would not let me. I struggled for a moment. I felt bouncy and happy. I knew that I liked both of them, and I also knew then that I was not afraid of them. I wanted to joke with them, I did not know how, and I kept on laughing and patting them on their shoulders. I had another peculiar awareness. I was certain that I was dreaming. If I focused my eyes on anything, it immediately became blurry. Don Juan and Don Juan were talking to me. I could not keep their words straight, and I could not distinguish which of them was talking. Don Juan then turned my body around and pointed to a lump on the ground. Don Juan pulled me closer to it and made me go around it. The lump was a man lying on the ground. He was lying on his stomach, his face turned to his right. They kept on pointing out the man to me as they spoke. They pulled me and twisted me around him. I could not focus my eyes on him at all, but finally I had a feeling of quietness and sobriety, and I looked at the man. I had a slow awakening into the realization that the man lying on the ground was me. My realization did not bring any terror or discomfort. I simply accepted it without emotion. At that moment I was not completely asleep, but neither was I completely awake and in sober consciousness. I also became more aware of Don Juan and Don Genero, and could tell them apart when they talked to me. Don Juan said that we were going to go to the round power place in the chaparral. As soon as he said it, the image of the place popped in my mind. I saw the dark masses of bushes around it. I turned to my right. Don Juan and Don Genero were also there. I had a jolt and the feeling that I was afraid of them. Perhaps because they looked like two menacing shadows. They came closer to me. As soon as I saw their features, my fears vanished. I liked them again. It was as if I were drunk and did not have a firm grip on anything. They grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me in unison. They ordered me to wake up. I could hear their voices clearly and separately. I had then a unique moment. I held two images in my mind, two dreams. I felt that something in me was deeply asleep and was waking up, and I found myself lying on the floor of the Ramada with Don Juan and Don Genero shaking me. But I also was at the power place and Don Juan and Don Genero were still shaking me. There was one crucial instant in which I was neither in one place nor the other, but I was rather in both places as an observer seeing two scenes at once. I had the incredible sensation that at that instant I could have gone either way. All I had to do at that moment was to change perspective, and rather than watch either scene from the outside, feel it from the point of view of the subject. There was something very warm about Don Juan's house. I preferred that scene. I next had a terrifying seizure, so shocking that my entire ordinary awareness came back to me at once. Don Juan and Don Genero were pouring buckets of water on me. I was in the Ramada of Don Juan's house. Hours later we sat in the kitchen. Don Juan had insisted that I had to proceed as if nothing had happened. He gave me some food and said that I had to eat a great deal to compensate for my expenditure of energy. It was after 9 in the evening when I looked at my watch after we had sat down to eat. My experience had lasted several hours. From the point of view of my recollection, however, it seemed that I had just fallen asleep for a short while. Even though I was completely myself, I still was numb. It was not until I had begun to write in my notebook that I regained my usual awareness. It was a surprise to me that taking notes could bring about instantaneous sobriety. The moment I was myself again, a barrage of reasonable thoughts immediately came to my mind. They purported to explain the phenomenon I had experienced. I knew on the spot that Don Genero had hypnotized me the moment he pinned me down on the ground, but I did not attempt to figure out how he had done it. They both laughed hysterically when I expressed my thoughts. Don Genero examined my pencil and said that the pencil was the key to wind up my mainspring. I felt quite belligerent. I was tired and irritable. I found myself practically yelling at them while their bodies shook with laughter. Don Juan said that it was permissible to miss the boat, but not by such a wide margin, and that Don Genero had come exclusively to help me and show me the mystery of the dreamer and the dreamed. My irritability came to a peak. Don Juan signaled Don Genero with a movement of his head. Both of them stood and took me around the house. There Don Genero demonstrated his great repertoire of animal grunts and cries. He asked me to choose one, and he taught me how to reproduce it. After hours of practice, I got to the point where I could imitate it quite well. The end result was that they themselves had enjoyed my clumsy attempts and laughed until they were practically weeping, and I had released my tension by reproducing the loud cry of an animal. I told them that there was something truly awesome in my imitation. The relaxation of my body was unequaled. Don Juan said that if I would perfect a cry, I could turn it into an affair of power, or I could simply use it to relieve my tension whenever I needed to. He suggested I should go to sleep. But I was afraid to fall asleep. I sat with them by the kitchen fire for a while, and then, quite unintentionally, I fell into a deep sleep. I woke up at dawn. Don Gennaro was sleeping by the door. He seemingly woke up at the same time I did. They had covered me up and folded my jacket as a pillow. I felt very calm and rested. I commented to Don Gennaro that I had felt exhausted the night before. He said that so had he. He whispered as if he were confiding in me, and told me that Don Juan was even more exhausted because he was older. "You and I are young," he said with a glint in his eyes. "But he's old. He must be about 300 now." I sat up hurriedly. Don Gennaro covered his face with his blanket and roared with laughter. Don Juan came into the room at that moment. I had a feeling of completeness and peace. For once, nothing really mattered. I was so at ease that I wanted to weep. Don Juan said that the night before I had begun to be aware of my luminosity. He admonished me not to indulge in the sense of well-being I was having, because it would turn into complacency. At this moment, I said, I don't want to explain anything. It doesn't matter what Don Gennaro did to me last night. I didn't do anything to you, Don Gennaro retorted. Look, it's me, Gennaro. You're Gennaro. Touch me. I embraced Don Gennaro, and we both laughed like two children. He asked me if I thought it was strange that I could embrace him then when last time I had seen him there I had been unable to touch him. I assured him that those issues were no longer pertinent to me. Don Juan's comment was that I was indulging in being broad-minded and good. Watch out, he said. The warrior never lets his guard down. If you keep on being so happy you're going to drain the little power you have left. What should I do? I asked. Be yourself, he said. Doubt everything. Be suspicious. But I don't like to be that way, Don Juan. It is not a matter of whether you like it or not. What matters is, what can you use as a shield? A warrior must use everything available to him to close his mortal gap once it opens. So, it's of no importance that you really don't like to be suspicious or ask questions. That's your only shield now. Right. Or you'll die. To die with elation is a crappy way of dying. How should a warrior die, then? Don Gennaro asked in exactly my own tone of voice. A warrior dies the hard way, Don Juan said. His death must struggle to take him. A warrior does not give himself to it. Don Gennaro opened his eyes to an enormous size and then blinked. What Gennaro showed you yesterday is of utmost importance, Don Juan went on. You can't slough it off with piousness. Yesterday you told me that you had been driven wild with the idea of the double. But look at you now. You don't care anymore. That's the trouble with people that go wild, they go wild both ways. Yesterday you were all questions, today you are all acceptance. I pointed out that he always found a flaw in what I did, regardless of how I did it. That's not true, he exclaimed. There is no flaw in the warrior's way. Follow it and your acts cannot be criticized by anyone. Take yesterday as an example. The warrior's way would have been, first, to ask questions without fear and without suspicion, and then let Genero show you the mystery of the dreamer, without fighting him or draining yourself. Today, the warrior's way would be to assemble what you've learned, without presumptuousness and without piousness. Do that and no one can find flaws in it. I thought by his tone that Don Juan must have been terribly annoyed with my blunderings. But he smiled at me and then giggled as if his own words had made him laugh. I told him that I was just holding back, not wanting to burden them with my probes. I was indeed overwhelmed by what Don Genero had done. I had been convinced, although it no longer mattered, that Don Genero had been waiting in the bushes for Don Juan to call him. Then later on he had cashed in on my fright and used it to stun me. After being held forcibly on the ground, I must have undoubtedly passed out, and then Don Genero must have mesmerized me. Don Juan argued that I was too strong to be subdued that easily. What took place then? I asked him. Genero came to see you to tell you something very exclusive, he said. When he came out of the bushes, he was Genero the double. There is another way to talk about this that would explain it better, but I can't use it now. Why not, Don Juan? Because you are not ready yet to talk about the totality of oneself. For the time being, I can only say that this Genero here is not the double now. He pointed to Don Genero with a movement of his head. Don Genero blinked repeatedly. The Genero of last night was the double. And as I told you already, the double has inconceivable power. He showed you a most important issue. In order to do that, he had to touch you. The double simply tapped you on the neck, on the same spot the ally walked over you years ago. Naturally, you went out like a light. And naturally too, you indulged like a son of a bitch. It took us hours to round you up. Thus, you dissipated your power, and when the time came for you to accomplish a warrior's feat, you did not have enough sap. What was that warrior's feat, Don Juan? I told you that Genero came to show you something, the mystery of luminous beings as dreamers. You wanted to know about the double. It begins in dreams. But then you asked, what is the double? And I said the double is the self. The self dreams the double. That should be simple, except that there is nothing simple about us. Perhaps the ordinary dreams of the self are simple, but that doesn't mean that the self is simple. Once it has learned to dream the double, the self arrives at this weird crossroad, and a moment comes when one realizes that it is the double who dreams the self. I had written down everything he had said. I had also paid attention to what he was saying, but had failed to understand him. Don Juan repeated his statements. The lesson last night, as I told you, was about the dreamer and the dreamed, or who dreams whom. I beg your pardon, I said. Both of them broke into laughter. Last night, Don Juan proceeded, you almost chose to wake up at the power place. What do you mean, Don Juan? That would have been the feat. If you had not indulged in your stupid ways, you would have had enough power to tip the scales, and you would have, no doubt, scared yourself to death. Fortunately or unfortunately, as the case may be, you did not have enough power. In fact, you wasted your power in worthless confusion to the point that you almost didn't have enough to survive. So, as you may very well understand, to indulge in your little quirks is not only stupid and wasteful, but also injurious. A warrior that drains himself cannot live. The body is not an indestructible affair. You might have gotten gravely ill. You didn't, simply because Genero and I deviated some of your crap. The full impact of his words was beginning to take hold of me. Last night Gennaro guided you through the intricacies of the double, Don Juan went on. Only he can do that for you. And it was not a vision or a hallucination when you saw yourself lying on the ground. You could have realized that with infinite clarity if you had not gotten lost in your indulging, and you could have known then that you yourself are a dream, that your double is dreaming you, in the same fashion that you dreamed him last night. But how can that be possible, Don Juan? No one knows how it happens. We only know that it does happen. That's the mystery of us as luminous beings. Last night you had two dreams and you could have awakened in either one, but you didn't have enough power even to understand that. They looked at me fixedly for a moment. I think he understands, Don Gennaro said. The secret of the luminous beings. Don Gennaro delighted me for hours with some preposterous instructions on how to manage my daily world. Don Juan said that I should be very careful and serious-minded about the recommendations made by Don Gennaro, because, although they were funny, they were not a joke. Around noon Don Gennaro stood up and without saying a word walked into the bushes. I was also going to get up, but Don Juan gently held me down, and in a solemn voice, announced that Don Gennaro was going to try one more thing with me. What's he up to? I asked. What is he going to do to me? Don Juan assured me that I did not have to worry. You are approaching a crossroad, he said. A certain crossroad that every warrior comes to. I had the idea that he was talking about my death. He seemed to anticipate my question and signaled me not to say anything. We won't discuss this matter, he said. Suffice it to say that the crossroad I'm referring to is the sorcerer's explanation. Gennaro believes you're ready for it. When are you going to tell me about it? I don't know when. You are the recipient, therefore it is up to you. You will have to decide when. What's wrong with right now? To decide doesn't mean to choose an arbitrary time, he said. To decide means that you have trimmed your spirit impeccably, and that you have done everything possible to be worthy of knowledge and power. Today, however, you must solve a little riddle for Gennaro. He's gone ahead of us and he'll be waiting somewhere in the chaparral. No one knows the spot where he'll be, or the specific time to go to him. If you're capable of determining the right time to leave the house, you will also be capable of guiding yourself to where he is. I told Don Juan that I could not imagine anyone being able to solve such a riddle. How can leaving the house at a specific time guide me to where Don Gennaro is? I asked. Don Juan smiled and began to hum a tune. He seemed to enjoy my agitation. That's the problem which Gennaro has set up for you, he said. If you have enough personal power, you will decide with absolute certainty the right time to leave the house. How leaving at the precise time will guide you is something that no one knows. And yet, if you have enough power, you yourself will attest that this is so. But how am I going to be guided, Don Juan? No one knows that either. I think Don Gennaro is pulling my leg. You better watch out then, he said. If Gennaro is pulling your leg, he's liable to yank it out. Don Juan laughed at his own joke. I could not join him. My fear about the inherent danger of Don Gennaro's manipulations was too real. Can you give me some clues? I asked. There are no clues, he said cuttingly. Why does Don Gennaro want to do this? He wants to test you, he replied. Let's say that it is very important for him to know whether you can take the sorcerer's explanation. If you solve the riddle, the implication will be that you have stored enough personal power and you're ready. But if you flub it, it'll be because you don't have enough power, and in that case the sorcerer's explanation won't make any sense to you. I think that we should give you the explanation regardless of whether you understand it or not. That's my idea. Gennaro is a more conservative warrior. He wants things in their proper order, and he won't give in until he thinks you're ready. Why don't you just tell me about the sorcerer's explanation yourself? Because Gennaro must be the one who helps you. Why is that so, Don Juan? Gennaro doesn't want me to tell you why, he said. Not yet. Would it hurt me to know the sorcerer's explanation? I asked. I don't think so. Please, Don Juan, tell me then. You must be joking. Gennaro has precise ideas on this matter, and we must honor and respect them. He made an imperative gesture to quiet me. After a long unnerving pause, I ventured a question. But how can I solve this riddle, Don Juan? I really don't know that, thus I can't advise you what to do, he said. Gennaro is most efficient. He designed the riddle just for you. Since he's doing this for your benefit, he's attuned to you alone, therefore only you can pick the precise time to leave the house. He will call you himself and guide you by means of his call. What will his call be like? I don't know. His call is for you, not for me. He'll be tapping your will directly. In other words, you must use your will in order to know the call. Gennaro feels that he must make sure, at this point, that you have stored sufficient personal power to enable you to turn your will into a functioning unit. Will was another concept which Don Juan had delineated with great care, but without making it clear. I had gathered from his explanations that will was a force that emanated from the umbilical region through an unseen opening below the navel, an opening he had called the gap. Will was allegedly cultivated only by sorcerers. It came to the practitioners veiled in mystery and purportedly gave them the capacity to perform extraordinary acts. I remarked to Don Juan that there was no chance that anything so vague could ever be a functioning unit in my life. That's where you're wrong, he said. The will develops in a warrior in spite of every opposition of the reason. Can't Don Gennaro, being a sorcerer, know whether I'm ready or not, without testing me? I asked. He certainly can, he said. But that knowledge won't be of any value or consequence, because it has nothing to do with you. You are the one who's learning, therefore you yourself must claim knowledge as power, not Gennaro. Gennaro is not concerned with his knowing as much as with your knowing. You must find out whether or not your will works. This is a very difficult point to make. In spite of what Gennaro or I know about you, you must prove to yourself that you are in the position to claim knowledge as power. In other words, you yourself have to be convinced that you can exercise your will. If you're not, then you must become convinced today. If you cannot perform this task, then Gennaro's conclusion will be that regardless of what he might see about you, you're not ready yet. I experienced an overwhelming apprehension. Is all this necessary? I asked. It's Gennaro's request and must be obeyed, he said in a firm but friendly tone. But what does Don Gennaro have to do with me? You may find that out today, he said and smiled. I pleaded with Don Juan to get me out of that intolerable situation and explain all the mysterious talk. He laughed and patted my chest and made a joke about a Mexican weightlifter who had enormous pectoral muscles but could not do heavy physical labor because his back was weak. "Watch those muscles," he said. "They shouldn't be just for show." "My muscles have nothing to do with what you're talking about," I said in a belligerent mood. "They do," he replied. "The body must be perfection before the will is a functioning unit." Don Juan had again deviated the direction of my probing. I felt restless and frustrated. I stood up and went to the kitchen and drank some water. Don Juan followed me and suggested that I should practice the animal cry that Don Gennaro had taught me. We walked to the side of the house. I sat on a pile of wood and involved myself in reproducing it. Don Juan made some corrections and gave me some pointers about my breathing. The end result was a state of complete physical relaxation. We returned to the Ramada and sat down again. I told him that sometimes I felt irked with myself because I was so helpless. "There is nothing wrong with the feeling of being helpless," he said. "All of us are most familiar with it. Remember that we have spent an eternity as helpless infants. I have already told you that at this very moment you are like an infant who can't get out of the crib by himself, much less act on his own. Gennaro gets you out of your crib, let's say, by picking you up. But an infant wants to act, and since he can't, he complains. There is nothing wrong with that, but to indulge in protesting and complaining is another matter." He demanded that I keep myself relaxed. He suggested that I ask him questions for a while, until I was in a better frame of mind. For a moment I was at a loss and could not decide what to ask. Don Juan unrolled a straw mat and told me to sit on it. Then he filled a large gourd with water and put it in a carrying net. He seemed to be preparing for a journey. He sat down again and urged me with a movement of his eyebrows to begin my questions. I asked him to tell me more about the moth. He gave me a long scrutinizing look and chuckled. "That was an ally," he said. "You know that." "But what actually is an ally, Don Juan?" "There is no way of saying what exactly an ally is, just as there is no way of saying what exactly a tree is." "A tree is a living organism," I said. "That doesn't tell me much," he said. "I can also say that an ally is a force, a tension. I've told you that already, but that doesn't say much about an ally. Just like in the case of a tree, the only way to know what an ally is by experiencing it. Over the years I have struggled to prepare you for the momentous encounter with an ally. You may not realize this, but it took you years of preparation to meet tree. To meet ally is no different. A teacher must acquaint his disciple with ally little by little, piece by piece. You have, over the course of the years, stored a great amount of knowledge about it, and now you are capable of putting that knowledge together to experience ally the way you experience tree. I have no idea that I'm doing that, Don Juan. Your reason is not aware of it, because it cannot accept the possibility of ally to begin with. Fortunately, it is not the reason which puts ally together. It is the body. You have perceived ally in many degrees and on many occasions. Each of those perceptions was stored in your body. The sum of those pieces is the ally. I don't know any other way of describing it. I said that I could not conceive that my body was acting by itself, as if it were an entity separate from my reason. It isn't, but we have made it so, he said. Our reason is petty and it is always at odds with our body. This, of course, is only a way of talking, but the triumph of a man of knowledge is that he has joined the two together. Since you're not a man of knowledge, your body does things now that your reason cannot comprehend. The ally is one of those things. You were not mad, neither were you dreaming when you perceived the ally that night, right here. I asked him about the frightening idea, which he and Don Gennaro had implanted in me, that the ally was an entity waiting for me at the edge of a small valley in the mountains of northern Mexico. They had told me that sooner or later I had to keep my appointment with the ally and wrestle with it. Those are ways of talking about mysteries for which there are no words, he said. Gennaro and I said that at the edge of that plain the ally was waiting for you. That statement was true, but it doesn't have the meaning that you want to give it. The ally is waiting for you, that's for sure, but it is not at the edge of any plain. It is right here, or there, or in any other place. The ally is waiting for you, just like death is waiting for you, everywhere and nowhere. Why is the ally waiting for me? For the same reason that death waits for you, he said, because you were born. There is no possibility of explaining at this point what is meant by that. You must first experience the ally. You must perceive it in its full force, then the sorcerer's explanation may throw light upon it. So far you've had enough power to clarify at least one point, that the ally is a moth. Some years ago you and I went to the mountains and you had a bout with something. I had no way of telling you then what was taking place. You saw a strange shadow flying back and forth in front of the fire. You yourself said that it looked like a moth. Although you didn't know what you were talking about, you were absolutely correct. The shadow was a moth. Then, on another occasion, something frightened you out of your wits after you had fallen asleep, again in front of a fire. I had warned you not to fall asleep, but you disregarded my warning. That act left you at the mercy of the ally, and the moth stepped on your neck. Why you survived will always be a mystery to me. You didn't know then, but I had given you up for dead. Your blunder was that serious. From then on, every time we've been in the mountains or in the desert, even if you didn't notice it, the moth always followed us. All in all then, we can say that for you the ally is a moth. But I cannot say that it is really a moth, the way we know moths. Calling the ally a moth is again only a way of talking, a way of making that immensity out there understandable. Is the ally a moth for you too? I asked. No. The way one understands the ally is a personal matter, he said. I mentioned that we were back where we had started. He had not told me what an ally really was. There's no need to be confused, he said. Confusion is a mood one enters into, but one can also get out of it. At this point there is no way of clarifying anything. Perhaps later on today we'll be able to consider these matters in detail. It's up to you. Or rather, it's up to your personal power. He refused to say one more word. I became quite upset with the fear that I was going to fail the test. Don Juan took me to the back of his house and made me sit on a straw mat at the edge of an irrigation ditch. The water moved so slowly that it almost seemed stagnant. He commanded me to sit quietly, shut off my internal dialogue and look at the water. He said that years before he had discovered that I had a certain affinity for bodies of water, a feeling that was most convenient for the endeavors I was involved in. I remarked that I was not particularly fond of bodies of water, but neither did I dislike them. He said that that was precisely why water was beneficial for me. I was indifferent towards it. Under conditions of stress, water could not trap me, but neither could it reject me. He sat slightly behind me to my right and admonished me to let go and not be afraid, because he was there to help me if there was any need. I had a moment of fear. I looked at him, waiting for further instructions. He forcibly turned my head towards the water and ordered me to proceed. I had no idea what he wanted me to do, so I simply relaxed. As I looked at the water, I caught sight of the reeds on the opposite side. Unconsciously, I rested my unfocused eyes on them. The slow current made them quiver. The water had the color of the desert dirt. I noticed that the ripples around the reeds looked like furrows or crevices on a smooth surface. At one instant the reeds became gigantic, the water was a smooth flat ochre surface, and then in a matter of seconds I was sound asleep, or perhaps I entered into a perceptual state for which I had no parallel. The closest way of describing it would be to say that I went to sleep and had a portentous dream. I felt that I could have gone on with it indefinitely if I had wanted to, but I deliberately ended it by engaging myself in a conscious self-dialogue. I opened my eyes. I was lying on the straw mat. Don Juan was a few feet away. My dream had been so magnificent that I began to recount it to him. He signaled me to be quiet. With a long twig, he pointed to two long shadows that some dry branches of desert chaparral cast on the ground. The tip of his twig followed the outline of one of the shadows, as if it were drawing it, then it jumped to the other and did the same with it. The shadows were about a foot long and over an inch wide. They were from 5 to 6 inches apart from each other. The movement of the twig forced my eyes out of focus, and I found myself looking with crossed eyes at 4 long shadows. Suddenly the 2 shadows in the middle merged into one and created an extraordinary perception of depth. There was some inexplicable roundness and volume in the shadow thus formed. It was almost like a transparent tube, a round bar of some unknown substance. I knew that my eyes were crossed, and yet they seemed to be focused on one spot. The view there was crystal clear. I could move my eyes without dispelling the image. I continued watching, but without letting my guard down. I experienced a curious compulsion to let go and immerse myself in the scene. Something in what I was observing seemed to pull me, but something in myself surfaced, and I began a semi-conscious dialogue. Almost instantly I became aware of my surroundings in the world of everyday life. Don Juan was watching me. He appeared to be puzzled. I asked him if there was something wrong. He did not answer. He helped me to sit up. It was only then that I realized that I had been lying on my back, looking at the sky, and Don Juan had been leaning over my face. My first impulse was to tell him that I had actually seen the shadows on the ground while I had been looking at the sky, but he put his hand over my mouth. We sat in silence for a while. I had no thoughts. I experienced an exquisite sense of peace, and then quite abruptly I had an unyielding urge to get up and go into the chaparral to look for Don Gennaro. I made an attempt to speak to Don Juan. He jutted his chin and twisted his lips as a silent command not to talk. I tried to assess my predicament in a rational manner. I was enjoying my silence so much, however, that I did not want to bother with logical considerations. After a moment's pause, I again felt the imperious need to walk into the bushes. I followed a trail. Don Juan tagged along behind me as if I were the leader. We walked for about an hour. I succeeded in remaining without any thoughts. Then we came to a hillside. Don Gennaro was there, sitting near the top of a rock wall. He greeted me effusively and had to yell his words. He was about 50 feet above the ground. Don Juan made me sit down and then sat next to me. Don Gennaro explained that I had found the place where he had been waiting because he had guided me with a sound he had been making. As he voiced his words, I realized that I had indeed been hearing a peculiar sound I thought to be a buzzing in my ears. It had seemed to be more of an internal affair, a bodily condition, a feeling of sound so undetermined that it was beyond the realm of conscious assessment and interpretation. I believed that Don Gennaro had a small instrument in his left hand. From where I sat I could not distinguish it clearly. It looked like a Jew's harp. With it he produced a soft eerie sound which was practically indiscernible. He kept on playing it for a moment, as if allowing me time to fully realize what he had just said. Then he showed me his left hand. There was nothing in it. He was not holding any instrument. It had appeared to me that he was playing some instrument because of the manner in which he had put his hand to his mouth. Actually, the sound was being produced with his lips and the edge of his left hand, between the thumb and index finger. I turned to Don Juan to explain to him that I had been fooled by Don Gennaro's movements. He made a quick gesture and told me not to talk and to pay close attention to what Don Gennaro was doing. I turned back to look at Don Gennaro, but he was no longer there. I thought that he must have climbed down. I waited a few moments for him to emerge from behind the bushes. The rock he had been standing on was a peculiar formation. It was more like a huge ledge on the side of a larger rock wall. I must have taken my eyes away from him for only a couple of seconds. If he had climbed up, I would have caught sight of him before he had reached the top of the rock wall, and if he had climbed down, he would also have been visible from where I was sitting. I asked Don Juan about Don Gennaro's whereabouts. He replied that he still was standing on the rock ledge. As far as I could judge, there was no one there, but Don Juan maintained over and over again that Don Gennaro was still standing on the rock. He did not seem to be joking. His eyes were steady and fierce. He said in a cutting tone that my senses were not the proper avenue to appraise what Don Gennaro was doing. He ordered me to shut off my internal dialogue. I struggled for a moment and began to close my eyes. Don Juan lurched at me and shook me by the shoulders. He whispered that I had to keep my view on the rock ledge. I had a sensation of drowsiness and heard Don Juan's words as if they were coming from far away. I automatically looked at the ledge. Don Gennaro was there again. That did not interest me. I noticed semi-consciously that it was very difficult for me to breathe, but before I could have a thought about it, Don Gennaro jumped to the ground. That act did not catch my interest either. He came over to me and helped me stand up, holding me by the arm. Don Juan held my other arm. They propped me up between the two of them. Then it was only Don Gennaro who was helping me walk. He whispered something in my ear that I could not understand, and suddenly I felt that he had pulled my body in some strange way. He grabbed me, in a manner of speaking, by the skin of my stomach, and pulled me up to the ledge, or perhaps onto another rock. I knew that for an instant I was on a rock. I could have sworn that it was the rock ledge. The image was so fleeting, however, that I could not evaluate it in detail. Then I felt that something in me faltered and I fell backwards. I had a faint feeling of anguish or perhaps physical discomfort. The next thing I knew, Don Juan was talking to me. I could not understand him. I concentrated my attention on his lips. The sensation I had was dreamlike, I was trying to rip from the inside an enveloping film-like sheet that encased me, while Don Juan tried to rip it from the outside. Finally, it actually popped and Don Juan's words became audible and their meaning crystal clear. He was commanding me to surface by myself. I struggled desperately to gain my sobriety. I had no success. I quite consciously wondered why I was having so much trouble. I fought to talk to myself. Don Juan seemed to be aware of my difficulty. He urged me to try harder. Something out there was preventing me from engaging myself and my familiar internal dialogue. It was as if a strange force were making me drowsy and indifferent. I fought against it until I began to lose my breath. I heard Don Juan talking to me. My body contorted involuntarily with the tension. I felt as if I were embraced and locked in mortal combat with something that was keeping me from breathing. I did not have fear, but rather some uncontrollable fury possessed me. My wrath mounted to such heights that I growled and screamed like an animal. Then my body was taken by a seizure. I had a jolt that stopped me instantly. I could again breathe normally, and then I realized that Don Juan had poured his gourd of water over my stomach and neck, soaking me. He helped me sit up. Don Gennaro was standing on the ledge. He called my name and then jumped to the ground. I saw him plummeting down from a height of 50 feet or so, and I experienced an unbearable sensation around my umbilical region. I had had the same sensation in dreams of falling. Don Gennaro came to me and asked me, smiling, if I had liked his leap. I tried unsuccessfully to say something. Don Gennaro called my name again. Carlitos. Watch me, he said. He swung his arms at his sides 4 or 5 times as if to get momentum, and then jumped out of sight, or I thought he did. Or perhaps he did something else for which I had no description. He was 5 or 6 feet away from me, and then he vanished as if he had been sucked away by an uncontrollable force. I felt aloof and tired. I had a sense of indifference and did not want to think or talk to myself. I was not afraid, but inexplicably sad. I wanted to weep. Don Juan hit me repeatedly with his knuckles on the top of my head and laughed as if everything that had happened were a joke. He then demanded that I talk to myself because that was the time when the internal dialogue was desperately needed. I heard him ordering me, talk. Talk. I had an involuntary spasm in the muscles of my lips. My mouth moved without sounds. I remembered Don Gennaro moving his mouth in a similar way when he was clowning, and I wished I could have said, as he had, my mouth doesn't want to talk. I tried to voice the words and my lips contorted in a painful way. Don Juan seemed to be on the verge of collapsing with laughter. His enjoyment was contagious and I also laughed. Finally, he helped me to stand up. I asked him if Don Gennaro was coming back. He said that Don Gennaro had had enough of me for the day. You almost made it, Don Juan said. We had been sitting near the fire in the earth stove. He had insisted that I eat. I was not hungry or tired. An unusual melancholy had overtaken me. I felt removed from all the events of the day. Don Juan handed me my writing pad. I made a supreme effort to recapture my usual state. I jotted down some comments. Little by little, I brought myself back into my old pattern. It was as if a veil were being lifted. Suddenly I was again involved in my familiar attitude of interest and bewilderment. Good, good, Don Juan said, patting my head. I've told you that the true art of a warrior is to balance terror and wonder." Don Juan's mood was unusual. He seemed almost nervous, anxious. He appeared to be willing to speak on his own accord. I believed that he was preparing me for the sorcerer's explanation, and I became quite anxious myself. His eyes had a strange glimmer that I had seen only a few times before. After I told him what I thought of his unusual attitude, he said that he was happy for me, that as a warrior, he could rejoice in the triumphs of his fellow men, if they were triumphs of the spirit. He added that unfortunately I was not yet ready for the sorcerer's explanation, in spite of the fact that I had successfully solved Don Gennaro's riddle. His contention was that when he had poured water over my body I had actually been dying, and my whole achievement had been cancelled out by my incapacity to fend off the last of Don Gennaro's onslaughts. "Gennaro's power was like a tide that engulfed you," he said. "Did Don Gennaro want to hurt me?" I asked. "No," he said. "Gennaro wants to help you. But power can be met only with power. He was testing you and you failed. But I solved his riddle, didn't I?" "You did fine," he said. "So fine that Gennaro had to believe that you were capable of a complete warrior's feat. You almost made it. What floored you this time was not indulging, though." "What was it then?" "You're too impatient and violent. Instead of relaxing and going with Gennaro, you began to fight him. You can't win against him. He's stronger than you." Don Juan then volunteered some advice and suggestions about my personal relations with people. His remarks were a serious sequel to what Don Gennaro had jokingly said to me earlier. He was in a talkative mood, and without any coaxing on my part, he began to explain what had taken place during the last 2 times I had been there. "As you know," he said, "the crux of sorcery is the internal dialogue, that is the key to everything. When a warrior learns to stop it, everything becomes possible, the most far-fetched schemes become attainable. The passageway to all the weird and eerie experiences that you have had recently was the fact that you could stop talking to yourself. You have, in complete sobriety, witnessed the ally, Gennaro's double, the dreamer and the dreamed, and today you almost learned about the totality of yourself. That was the warrior's feat that Gennaro expected you to perform. All this has been possible because of the amount of personal power that you have stored. It started the last time you were here when I caught sight of a very auspicious omen. As you arrived I heard the ally prowling around. First, I heard its soft steps, and then I saw the moth looking at you as you got out of your car. The ally was motionless, watching you. That to me was the best omen. Had the ally been agitated, moving around as if it was displeased with your presence, the way it always has been, the course of the events would have been different. Many times I have caught sight of the ally in an unfriendly state towards you, but this time the omen was right, and I knew that the ally had a piece of knowledge for you. That was the reason why I said that you had an appointment with knowledge. An appointment with a moth that had been pending for a long time. For reasons inconceivable to us, the ally selected the form of a moth to manifest itself to you. But you said that the ally was formless, and that one could only judge its effects, I said. That is right, he said. But the ally is a moth for the onlookers who are associated with you, Gennaro, and myself. For you, the ally is only an effect, a sensation in your body, or a sound, or the golden specks of knowledge. It remains as a fact, nonetheless, that by choosing the form of a moth, The ally is telling Genero and me something of great importance. Moths are the givers of knowledge and the friends and helpers of sorcerers. It is because the ally chose to be a moth around you that Genero places such a great emphasis on you. That night that you met the moth, as I had anticipated, was a true appointment with knowledge for you. You learned the moth's call, felt the gold dust of its wings, but above all, that night for the first time, you were aware that you saw and your body learned that we are luminous beings. You have not yet assessed correctly that monumental event in your life. Genero demonstrated for you with tremendous force and clarity that we are a feeling, and that what we call our body is a cluster of luminous fibers that have awareness. Last night you were back again under the good auspices of the ally. I came to look at you as you arrived, and I knew that I had to call Genero, so he could explain to you the mystery of the dreamer and the dreamed. You believed then, just as you always have, that I was tricking you, but Genero was not hiding in the bushes as you thought. He came over for you, even if your reason refuses to believe it. That part of Don Juan's elucidation was indeed the hardest to take at its face value. I could not admit it. I said that Don Genero had been real and of this world. Everything that you've witnessed so far has been real and of this world, he said. There is no other world. Your stumbling block is a peculiar insistence on your part, and that peculiarity of yours is not going to be cured by explanations. So today Genero addressed himself directly to your body. A careful examination of what you did today will reveal to you that your body put things together in a most praiseworthy manner. Somehow, you refrained from indulging in your visions at the irrigation ditch. You kept a rare control and aloofness as warriors should. You didn't believe anything, but you still acted efficiently, and thus you were capable of following Genero's call. You actually found him without any aid from me. When we arrived at the rock ledge, you were imbued with power, and you saw Genero standing where other sorcerers have stood, for similar reasons. He walked over to you after jumping from the ledge. He himself was all power. Had you proceeded as you did earlier by the irrigation ditch, you would have seen him as he really is, a luminous being. Instead, you got frightened, especially when Genero made you leap. That leap in itself should have been sufficient to transport you beyond your boundaries. But you didn't have the strength and fell back into the world of your reason. Then, of course, you entered into mortal combat with yourself. Something in you, your will, wanted to go with Genero, while your reason opposed him. Had I not helped you, you now would be lying dead and buried in that power place. But even with my help, the outcome was dubious for a moment. We were silent for a few minutes. I waited for him to speak. Finally I asked, "Did Don Genero make me leap up to the rock ledge?" "Don't take that leap in the sense that you understand a leap," he said. "Once again, this is only a way of speaking. As long as you think that you are a solid body, you cannot conceive what I am talking about." He then spilled some ashes on the ground by the lantern, covering an area about 2 feet square, and drew a diagram with his fingers, a diagram that had 8 points interconnected with lines. It was a geometrical figure. He had drawn a similar one years before when he tried to explain to me that it was not an illusion that I had observed the same leaf falling 4 times from the same tree. The diagram and the ashes had 2 epicenters, one he called reason, the other, will. Reason was interconnected directly with a point he called talking. Through talking, reason was indirectly connected to 3 other points: feeling, dreaming and seeing. The other epicenter, will, was directly connected to feeling, dreaming and seeing, but only indirectly to reason and talking. I remarked that the diagram was different from the one I had recorded years before. The outer form is of no importance, he said. These points represent a human being and can be drawn in any way you want. Do they represent the body of a human being? I asked. Don't call it the body, he said. These are 8 points on the fibers of a luminous being. A sorcerer says, as you can see in the diagram, that a human being is, first of all, will, because will is directly connected to 3 points, feeling, dreaming and seeing. Then next, a human being is reason. This is properly a center that is smaller than will, it is connected only with talking. What are the other 2 points, Don Juan? He looked at me and smiled. You're a lot stronger now than you were the first time we talked about this diagram, he said. But you're not yet strong enough to know all the 8 points. Genero will someday show you the other 2. Does everybody have those 8 points or only sorcerers? We may say that every one of us brings to the world 8 points. 2 of them, reason and talking, are known by everyone. Feeling is always vague but somehow familiar. But only in the world of sorcerers does one get fully acquainted with dreaming, seeing and will. And finally, at the outer edge of that world one encounters the other 2. The 8 points make the totality of oneself. He showed me in the diagram that in essence all the points could be made to connect with one another indirectly. I asked him again about the 2 mysterious remaining points. He showed me that they were connected only to will, and that they were removed from feeling, dreaming and seeing, and much more distant from talking and reason. He pointed with his finger to show that they were isolated from the rest and from each other. Those 2 points will never yield to talking or to reason, he said. Only will can handle them. Reason is so removed from them that it is utterly useless to try figuring them out. This is one of the hardest things to realize. After all, the forte of reason is to reason out everything. I asked him if the 8 points corresponded to areas or to certain organs in a human being. They do, he replied dryly and erased a diagram. He touched my head and said that that was the center of reason and talking. The tip of my sternum was the center of feeling. The area below the navel was will. Dreaming was on the right side against the ribs. Seeing on the left. He said that sometimes in some warriors seeing and dreaming were on the right side. Where are the other 2 points? I asked. He gave me a most obscene answer and broke into a belly laugh. You're so sneaky, he said. You think I'm a sleepy old goat, don't you? I explained to him that my questions created their own momentum. Don't try to hurry, he said. You'll know in due time and then you will be on your own, by yourself. Do you mean that I won't see you anymore, Don Juan? Not ever again, he said. Genero and I will be then what we always have been, dust on the road. I had a jolt in the pit of my stomach. What are you saying, Don Juan? I'm saying that we all are unfathomable beings, luminous and boundless. You, Genero and I are stuck together by a purpose that is not our decision. What purpose are you talking about? Learning the warrior's way. You can't get out of it, but neither can we. As long as our achievement is pending you will find me or Genero, but once it is accomplished, you will fly freely, and no one knows where the force of your life will take you. What is Don Genero doing in this? That subject is not in your realm yet, he said. Today I have to pound the nail that Genero put in, the fact that we are luminous beings. We are perceivers. We are an awareness. We are not objects. We have no solidity. We are boundless. The world of objects and solidity is a way of making our passage on earth convenient. It is only a description that was created to help us. We, or rather our reason, forget that the description is only a description, and thus we entrap the totality of ourselves in a vicious circle from which we rarely emerge in our lifetime. At this moment, for instance, you are involved in extricating yourself from the snarls of reason. It is preposterous and unthinkable for you that Genero just appeared at the edge of the chaparral, and yet you cannot deny that you witnessed it. You perceived it as such. Don Juan chuckled. He carefully drew another diagram in the ashes and covered it with his hat before I could copy it. We are perceivers, he proceeded. The world that we perceive, though, is an illusion. It was created by a description that was told to us since the moment we were born. We, the luminous beings, are born with 2 rings of power, but we use only one to create the world. That ring, which is hooked very soon after we are born, is reason, and its companion is talking. Between the 2 they concoct and maintain the world. So, in essence, the world that your reason wants to sustain is the world created by a description and its dogmatic and inviolable rules, which the reason learns to accept and defend. The secret of the luminous beings is that they have another ring of power which is never used, the will. The trick of the sorcerer is the same trick of the average man. Both have a description. One, the average man, upholds it with his reason. The other, the sorcerer, upholds it with his will. Both descriptions have their rules, and the rules are perceivable, but the advantage of the sorcerer is that will is more engulfing than reason. The suggestion that I want to make at this point is that from now on you should let yourself perceive whether the description is upheld by your reason or by your will. I feel that is the only way for you to use your daily world as a challenge and a vehicle to accumulate enough personal power in order to get to the totality of yourself. Perhaps the next time that you come you'll have enough of it. At any rate, wait until you feel, like you felt today at the irrigation ditch, that an inner voice is telling you to do so. If you come in any other spirit it'll be a waste of time and a danger to you. I remarked that if I had to wait for that inner voice I would never see them again. You'd be surprised how well one can perform if one is against a wall, he said. He stood up and picked up a bundle of firewood. He placed some dry sticks on the earth stove. The flames cast a yellowish glow on the ground. He then turned off the lantern and squatted in front of his hat, which was covering the drawing he had made in the ashes. He commanded me to sit calmly, shut off my internal dialogue, and keep my eyes on his hat. I struggled for a few moments, and then I felt a sensation of floating, of falling off a cliff. It was as if nothing were supporting me, as if I were not sitting or did not have a body. Don Juan lifted his hat. Underneath there were spirals of ashes. I watched them without thinking. I felt the spirals moving. I felt them in my stomach. The ashes seemed to pile up. Then they were stirred and fluffed, and suddenly Don Genero was sitting in front of me. The sight forced me instantly into my internal dialogue. I thought that I must have fallen asleep. I began to breathe in short gasps and tried to open my eyes, but my eyes were open. I heard Don Juan telling me to get up and move around. I jumped up and ran to the ramada. Don Juan and Don Genero ran after me. Don Juan brought his lantern. I could not catch my breath. I tried to calm myself as I had done before, by jogging in place while I faced the west. I lifted my arms and began breathing. Don Juan came to my side and said that those movements were done only in the twilight. Don Genero yelled that it was twilight for me, and both of them began to laugh. Don Genero ran to the edge of the bushes and then bounced back to the ramada, as if he had been attached to a giant rubber band that made him snap back. He repeated the same movement 3 or 4 times, and then came to my side. Don Juan had been looking at me fixedly, giggling like a child. They exchanged a furtive glance. Don Juan said to Don Genero in a loud voice that my reason was dangerous, and that it could kill me if it was not placated. "For heaven's sake!" Don Genero exclaimed in a roaring voice. "Placate his reason." They jumped up and down and laughed like 2 children. Don Juan made me sit down underneath the lantern and handed me my notebook. "Tonight we're really pulling your leg," he said in a conciliatory tone. "Don't be afraid." Genero was hiding under my hat. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.